Our world is lost in unnecessary fear and hurt. Our systems seem scientifically engineered to make you small, powerless, and always waiting for the next great leader who will fix the problems around us. Worse, we're witnessing neighbor versus neighbor while warfare breaks out around our family tables. But you have access to a spirit, a strength that enlarges and empowers you. Even better, you don't need to wait for the next big movement. You can heal the world. It's time for governance by grace. Welcome to Gracearchy with Jim Babka.
So we just finished having a discussion and decided not to turn off the camera. I just want to keep going on something because we had one more topic that we had still sitting on our plate. We are, once again, Gracearchy, brought to you by the Zero Aggression Project, zeroaggressionproject.org, where, they help us with the business functions of the show and make sure that we have audience. They help us get audience, eyes and ears on the podcast. So if you're not subscribed, please go to zeroaggressionproject.org and do so right now. And if you are, please subscribe to whatever platform you're listening to right now, where you're catching us. Don't miss it. That way you're going to get alerted as soon as we come on. I'm playing a little bit of your role here today, Bill. I'm stealing a little bit
You're
of your
doing it well. You're doing it well.
Okay. But there was another thing that we had on our plate, which was a story about a pilot. And I want to explore that for the issues that unfold in this pilot that needed treatment and couldn't get it. So why don't we get into that?
Yeah, this is Joe Emerson, who was, gosh, I almost said deadheading. I guess I'm going to have to say it. He was in a jump seat in the cockpit of an Alaska Airlines flight when the effects of a psilocybin journey that he'd taken only a few days before came back big time. So we want to address that in this short episode.
There's this pilot, right?
Yeah.
He goes out and he pulls the levers to pull a plane down. He's accused of trying to do a suicide murder pact, basically. He's in the jump seat. He's not even the actual pilot of the plane. He's just a working pilot. And he blames psilocybin.
Well, so I'm going to plug an organization here that we probably shouldn't be plugging, but the New York Times has a documentary series on Hulu. So it's a Disney Channel. It's family. I respect the fact that they put this story out there. This is an off-duty pilot who's just coming home from a psilocybin retreat with his buddies. He gets a jump seat. For whatever reason, the jump seat is in the cockpit. They had other options, but they put him in the cockpit. And this is less than 24 hours after the journey, right after his psilocybin journey.
Okay.
And he's still tripping. He's not in a great place to be able to determine what's real and what's not.
So 2 days later, he's still tripping.
Yeah. He's still experiencing.
Is that normal?
It can be. There's, these are whole plant medicines. They can do all kinds of things, right? But the fact that 2 days later, he's still experiencing a detachment from reality says to me that whatever he went into the journey with needed professional guidance. He needed the help of somebody who really knew what was going on to make sure the journey was safe, and that he didn't try to, certainly not drive a car, fly a plane, but he needed more time to process this, and he wasn't able to take it for all the logistical reasons. So he's trying to get back to reality and did some crazy stuff.
Starting with reaching up and pulling two safety levers that are there. They're big red safety levers. Excuse me. The presence of these levers is designed to, in emergency, where like an engine of the plane is caught on fire, you can automatically kind of kill the engine, right? Yeah. But it's other than a fire, which is already a really bad situation. You don't want to kill an engine on a plane, right? No, you got.
Yep.
In this particular case, as I understand it, there were 83 other human beings on board the plane, aside from this pilot.
Yep.
And he reached up to pull those levers. And the pilots who were flying a plane had to physically restrain him.
Yep.
They had to stop him.
And when they did, you can watch the documentary. It's a New York Times documentary series. he describes the experience. That was enough. He knew he needed to get out of the cockpit. He knew he needed to be sitting somewhere else so that he wouldn't harm anybody. That came through.
So he's not flying the plane.
He's not flying the plane.
He's a pilot looking to maybe get back home. Right?
Yeah, he's heading home.
He's allowed to sit in the office, so to speak, while the other people are working.
But he is not in command of the plane. He's not the pilot or the co-pilot.
Okay, but what do the other pilots think? What do the other pilots who are running the plane think of his behavior?
Well, they have transcripts and actual audio from the cockpit, and basically they knew that they needed to do something to get Joe out of the way, and they did. And
what about now?
Well, he hasn't flown since.
No, I'm talking about the other pilots. Like, what is their take on the behavior that they witnessed that day?
That is a really great thing. They did not, in the New York Times documentary, they didn't interview the pilots, the other pilots who were there, but they did interview two of the crew members and like the stews who were there. And both of them said that Joe asked to be put into restraints so that he couldn't do anything because he knew that he was in a place that wasn't safe and he didn't want to be responsible for any.
And so in his lack of reality, he had decided he wanted to commit suicide?
He wasn't trying to commit suicide. What he was trying to do is just figure out what was real. Because he felt in the plane that he was still tripping.
How was pulling those levers going to show what was real?
That's a dramatic moment in the documentary. And he thought that by doing that, because he knew what the levers would do, that would be the break between fantasy and reality. That would somehow return him to reality. It's like, if this is a dream and I pull these levers, nothing's going to happen.
Okay, we just recorded an episode where we sat and talked about the virtues and benefits and why this entire area of both psychedelics and psychotropics should be deregulated, right? It should be free. And when I first become aware of this story, which I believe you got a clip for, right?
Yeah.
When I first become aware of this story, my first instinct is this guy's got a PR machine that gets him to this level. He's got he started a nonprofit and he's blaming a psychedelic for what happened. And here's MDMA in the headlines, right? I realize they're not the same substance, but like there's this kind of this public mentality that maybe the drug war has gone too far. Or, I'm sorry, the drug legalization movement has gone too far. And he's maybe even scapegoating it to some degree. All these actions could be kind of conjured up to reduce his sentence.
Oh, that's true. They could be. Although from watching the documentary, I suspect that he'll accept whatever sentence comes his way, which has already been reduced, by the way. Instead of 83 counts of attempted murder, it's now 83 counts of reckless endangerment. So
I mean, there is kind of this like no harm, no foul type of situation, right? Nobody on the plane was actually harmed by his act. Well, they did have the minimal inconvenience that they didn't get to land in the city they were headed for.
Yeah, they were headed for San Francisco and landed in Portland. So there's that.
Oh,
but nobody. Yeah, in Portland of all places, which is actually kind of ironic, right? Given the fact that So, but there's this idea of responsible use that's coming back, and the bigger picture on all this is that pilots, particularly, and air traffic controllers, if you raise your hand and say, I've got a mental health issue, you're immediately furloughed, half pay, and it can take 18 months to get your license back, or if it's severe, you may never fly again. So the issue that Joe Emerson is his name. So the issue Joe Emerson.
Wait a minute. There might be a legitimate reason for not having somebody fly again.
That's right. Of course.
Okay. So what he was initially accused of, or what actually made the headlines, or what initially provoked the prosecution, was a belief that this was a suicide attempt. So there's this phenomena wherein school shooters engage in it, right?
Yep.
Or people who do mass shootings frequently will off themselves. They'll commit suicide in the end, but they're going to make the world feel the pain before they do it, right?
Yep.
There may also be a case in the pilot where maybe they can maybe create an error, right, where they end up killing themselves, right? And maybe there's some deniability as to whether or not it was really there's some issues there that are kind of like sticky about the fact that we have someone who literally has what could be, if not tens, maybe even hundreds of people whose lives they're responsible for at that moment, who are powerless to somebody who would do something like Joe did, right?
Oh yeah.
Like if Joe was actually the pilot of the plane and he successfully pulled those levers correctly, if he had been successful in his effort, the situation could have been a lot worse.
Yeah.
So we have a reason for wanting to be extra careful. There's a risk principle at stake here, right?
When
There
it
are
comes
certain
to pilots, particularly and controllers, yeah.
Okay, so there are risks that we can take that are minor in life that will not have a long-term consequence, right? And if the risk is low, then the action shouldn't be regulated whatsoever. Or if the risk is only to the individual themselves, there shouldn't be any consideration of like what its effect is on other people, right? Or whether or not anybody else likes it. Those things should be hands off. But when now you do something that potentially impacts everybody, and you only need one mistake to create a catastrophic event, right? So, like, we don't want any planes falling out of the sky, and then they decide to err on the cautionary side of like, okay, we're not going to let these people up in the air.
The point is that if as a pilot, if you had some way of getting help that didn't end your career,
then more people would get it.
More people get help, right? And the documentary sadly highlights several cases that date back to the 70s of pilots who've flown their planes into the ground or a mountain or wherever because they had suicidal ideation and they wanted to end it. In fact, we have one case that's recent where that I think it was a German plane that was crashed in the Alps. The pilot left, the co-pilot flew the plane into the mountain and left a note.
So we come back to this premise that we addressed in the episode we recorded on legalizing psychedelics and psychotropics, right? And that is utopia is not on the plate. There's no perfect solution here. So, there's a market demand for certain products. That was what we discussed before, but there's also going to be people who kill themselves. Like, suicidal ideation will occur. It's a naturally occurring phenomenon that we can guarantee. In fact, even as we're sitting here talking right now, somebody's experiencing it.
Yeah, yeah. But you don't want a pilot of your plane untreated with those kinds of issues. And what Joe's nonprofit, Clear Skies Ahead or whatever is trying to point out is that we need to have a pathway for pilots to get help. Because a pilot that's untreated and suffering severe mental and emotional distress in the cockpit is probably more dangerous than a pilot who is having treatment for those same issues.
That seems reasonable, right? I mean, who would argue with the reasonableness of the statement that you just made?
Well, nobody would argue with the reasonableness, but the FAA will take away your license if you even raise your hand.
Okay, but I actually believe this is from this utopian thinking that if we ban something, it will go away, right?
Right.
We can ban being gay and then the gay will go away. We can ban swearing and then nobody will ever swear ever again. We can ban drugs and drugs will go away. And it turns out, here we've got this entity saying for sound safety reasons, maybe we'll just ban suicide.
Oh yeah, that'll work.
Well, never
do what they did, like on the Golden Gate Bridge. You might decide that suicide is bad for your bridge, so put it in a net, catch people. At the very least, maybe they'll look for a different way of doing that.
But see, there you go. That's what you do in that particular situation.
Right.
If the regulation's good enough, all it will do is take a particularly determined person and drive them into another direction. They will find a substitute.
And that's Joe Emerson's
not really
point. It's like,
that's not really the solution. It's not really a solution.
It's not a solution, right?
Okay.
Because
but I will say this. Let's acknowledge something, because I imagine already what went through people's minds as they hear that is that, well, if the pilot is going to suicide himself with his own gun or his own rope and not with a plane, that's preferable. And you know what? I can't disagree with that statement either. That is equally reasonable, right?
Yep.
So if you had the net, so to speak, for the plane that made it so that the plane was more likely to be safe, did they give any, because I didn't get to see this documentary, but did they give, I'm aware of the story, but I didn't see the documentary. Did they give any examples of pilots, commercial pilots flying major commercial planes, sending their planes into mountains or the ground on purpose?
Yes, that's the one that I mentioned in the Alps, where the German pilot, and there are 4 others, sadly, commercial flights where the pilots took the plane and their own life on purpose.
Okay, so this is not an epidemic problem, but it probably is still the case that there are a lot of pilots silently or quietly suffering.
Oh, sure. Or watch the movie Pushing Tin if you want to know what it's really like. That was a pretty good dramatization of what the air traffic controller stress feels like.
Because they're affected by the same rules.
Affected by the same rules, dealing with the same issues. The only thing that the air traffic
So now
controller
they're
doesn't see is weather.
suicidal. They don't have suicidal ideation. If I'm an air traffic controller and I'm a bit disconnected from reality in some way, I'm not going to kill myself. It's going to just be the occupants on the plane. It's interesting to me that the same rules adhere to people who are firmly planted on the ground, so to speak.
Well, so this also affects people in the military. There are lots of government regulated professions where if you say, I need help, commanding officer, forget about any further promotions, forget about anything. It's a career-ending move if you're in one of those high-stress, government-regulated positions, other than politics, I suppose, to be able to say, yeah, I'm human and I want my happiness back.
If you're in politics, you can get all the hookers and blow you want. Okay, it's a free for all. There's no
right.
In fact, they have clubs that they can do that together, right? They can make a senator sandwich if they want, right? And they can stick an airline attendant in the middle of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
This is not an industry that is holding itself to the highest moral, ethical, and commercial standard.
But just think about it, Jim. We've had so many close call collisions on the ground, on the tarmac of planes, bumping into, or in one case over in Hong Kong, I think it was, there was a collision.
Is that suicidal ideation?
Fatal. No, that's just the stress of not being able to hold it all together as doing your job. And that's what we worry about. Like, how much will this stress that I'm under, this distress, affect my ability to do the job that I have, whether that's flying a plane full of people safely from one place to another, or guiding that plane as an air traffic controller. And those are the most, well, especially these days with all the crazy weather and incidents, the stress in those jobs is not diminishing. And so people like Joe who want to try to find a way of dealing with that have to do that because life happens. So, Joe was dealing with the death of a very good friend. His lifelong friend had died. Things happen in life, right, that affect us as human beings. And to be able to still do our job successfully under those external stress factors that are quite normal is a big thing. We're not shooting at people like veterans are. We're not taking lives or watching our buddies die next to us, which are incredibly trauma-producing things too. But,
okay, so in the case of pilots, in the documentary, was called what again?
It's called Lie to Fly. The implication is if you don't tell anybody, you can keep your job.
Okay, so in this documentary, did they actually cover solutions? And what I mean by solutions, I mean like concrete. These are things that our nonprofit, the nonprofit this pilot Joe has created. I mean, because let's just talk about Joe for one more second. Joe, whatever you think of his motives or what he did, what you just described seems incredibly reasonable to me in terms of making sure that our pilots have outlets and the ability to get help, and that actually would increase safety in the aggregate. It would also be better for the individual human beings involved. So I'm all for that. And Joe could make the world a better place if he's successful in his nonprofit, but I guess that depends on what the ideas are. So
yeah.
What are the ideas here? What are the specific remedies that he's calling for?
One of the interesting things is how little psilocybin came up in the whole conversation. The documentary points that out as they're describing Joe's experience on the plane, but then it just goes away. The proposals are very statist.
Of course.
The FAA is overwhelmed with psychological evaluations, and they have like one person doing it, and they need more.
Yeah. So if we just would make the bureaucracy bigger,
but you can guess what all the answers are going to be.
Oh my God. So he's not going to do any good.
Well, he might do some good on the margins.
In terms of raising awareness, maybe?
In terms of raising awareness, somebody needs to stand up.
See, why does everybody
men and
need
women.
to? This is something I don't understand. Why does everybody have to wait for the government to be like, oh, we're going to change our policy now? Why? And I
Okay,
could
so
tell you in the airline industry, a part of the answer to that question is that every single bolt on the plane is government regulated somehow. I
Yep.
mean, how many times do we still, as adults, need to be told how a seatbelt works?
Yep.
That is entirely because of government regulation.
Yep.
There's a whole host of those kinds of things on the plane.
Yep.
So I know that that's part of the reason they're giving that answer. But there is a lack of imagination about how to think about. See, again, I got to say this again. I said it when we were talking about the psychedelics and psychotropics, but just here in this context too, our social muscles and our creativity has atrophied with the lack of use. This over-reliance on the experts of the state, who somehow are going to have the answers, and those answers are going to be great. And the world's going to be so much better if we just enact the program and we hire the right number of bureaucrats to do it, and we pound everybody good and hard in a position. It's all going to turn out for the best. And it just never works.
It never works.
We end up in this. I mean, that's how we got. Let me just be clear. The situation we've been describing this whole time, literally how we got there. Somebody came up with a rule and said, you know what? We need to keep every single pilot that's got any kind of emotional problem from getting behind the plane. We're going to ban depression.
Well, you're going to ban pilots if you do that, because being a pilot is not a cakewalk. It's like being a doctor, right? You're responsible for a lot of people, so you've got to cross a lot of bars and make sure you know what you're doing, and it's complex. Even though you can watch the videos, right? It just looks like it's easy peasy. Change the dial of the plane.
But if the crutch manufacturer walked around breaking people's legs, like they sent people out with clubs and broke their legs so that they could sell more crutches, right, someone would wake up soon and say, you know what? This crutch industry is pretty corrupt. They keep breaking people's legs. But as Harry Brown pointed out, that's exactly what the government does. They break your legs, hand you a pair of crutches, say, see, without us, you wouldn't be able to walk. Yep. And everybody goes, oh, you know what we need? We need nicer crutches.
Yep.
I just, the mind boggles.
Well,
here's a serious problem that's being identified.
Yeah.
And the solution is, let's not solve it. Let's call for more government.
I'd like to see where Joe comes down on this. And because the nonprofit is like months old, it's not really what we call up and running yet.
He's got a heck of a start by getting a documentary published by the New York Times that's appearing on Hulu. Right.
So I would say that this turns into a social movement. And I'll tell you right now, I would fly with Joe right now today. If he had a license and he was going somewhere and I could choose a pilot, I'd fly with him without fear. And I would do that because for all the public knowledge that we have, we know that he made an attempt to return himself to happiness. He made an attempt that he had to do it illegally because, these substances are illegal. But he was willing to put himself in that place to find relief. And that place, that's got to be a bad place. Because if you're willing to go that far, there's something that's wrong. And for sure, by now, he's getting help for that, right? So that makes me feel a whole lot better about flying with him than some pilot I don't know.
So I think you bring up a couple of good points by saying that. I don't think it's mere grace that makes you say that. It's really, really interesting in life that when people are given a second chance, when trust is invested in them after they've fouled up. So you've applied grace here and you said, you fouled up and I trust you. Mm-hmm. That people in those situations tend to go above and beyond and be even better than some of the very best, right? They are more zealous, they're more committed, they're more assertive in doing the right thing now.
Yep.
Because they recognize what they lost and they want to take full advantage of it. And because somebody trusted them, they have special affection for that because they already know what it feels like to be judged.
Yep.
So I get where you're coming from there. But I want to talk about, you suggested that, let me just make sure I got the facts straight of the story. He goes out with his buddies and takes psychotropic drugs. That's how this works here?
Yeah. So he had been dealing with a lot external to being a pilot, which is not a great job. You're never home. You get yanked off at the last minute to do other stuff that you didn't plan on doing. So there's all of that. Plus, he's dealing with some grief, like his lifelong closest friend, who died suddenly, cardiac arrest or something. So he's got that. Stressful job anyway, add some other factors. There's a retreat, somebody had some mushrooms. Hey, let's do mushrooms. Okay, well, that's a little bit different than what you would do if you wanted to explore the depths of your grief and depression. You'd be working with a trip sitter, somebody who understands what the substance does to you and how it can go, and has lots of experience, like thousands of journeys that they've sat for, that can be there to help you through what you're going, who can notice what's going on with you, who can say, no, Jim, you're not ready yet to leave this place. You need to stay here in under 24 hours until you come down from this to a place where you're safe in the world, right? Where you can process what's real. None of those things were there. And that's a great tragedy.
There's an economic principle here. And, the beautiful thing about economics is that it doesn't care.
True.
And I mean that. Like you're grateful that gravity doesn't care, right? You're grateful that your trees want to exude oxygen and they just don't care, right? Care doesn't have anything to do with it. These things just function, they work a certain way. And that's the way economics is. It's an organism, it operates in an organism fashion. That's why we speak of things like an invisible hand, right? There's an organizational concept there that will occur. And it has to do with like what the incentives are. So when you put the state involved in something, one of the things that it automatically tends to do with its regulation is drive up the cost of the service. So what you want is a service that is so affordable that people feel that they have access to it when they want and need it.
Yeah.
That's the desirable state. Now that happens with everything. So that the less that it's touched by the government, the more that it is free to innovate. The trend is for it to go down in cost, to get smaller and smaller. You do more with less. That's the whole trend of everything.
Yeah.
Okay, so I say all this. It may seem like I just veered off into some other field and I forgot what we were talking about, but I didn't.
No. I'm right with you.
I want rather than someone going out with their buddies and doing kind of this because they weren't ready quite yet to spend the money or effort, or it wasn't even accessible to them, either given their occupation or the cost. What I would want is a situation where someone would have availed themselves of the services that you just described. The shaman's going to be there to be like, nope, you know what? You ain't ready for this. Or, hey, if you're coming here, you're going to spend this long, and this is how we're going to do it down, and this is how much we're going to give you. We know what this does. We know how to monitor you when you're done. We have access to experience and facilities to do this right. If the price point is low enough for that service, and he's not prohibited from using that service by any outside force, then why would he have gone and done something stupid, like take too much hanging out with his buddies?
Yeah, that is a good question. And other than how we go back to awareness again, with a little bit of awareness.
Okay, but when people have a commercial incentive, okay, we tend to say, oh, he's a salesman, and we mean this in some dirty way, like all they're trying to do is sell. They're advertising at us. It's kind of gross, right? But do you know what advertising and sales really are involved? They involve awareness and education. So advertising is awareness, marketing is awareness, and sales is education, right? That's what they are. And if you look at those in that context, someone would sit down and you would want to, like, you'd start to do your research. You would say, well, I better be careful how I do this. And I need to actually go sit somebody who has the expertise. And I'm going to do it because it's affordable enough to do it. They've figured out how, which is what normal business does when it's able to operate in the open as transparently as possible. They're going to find ways to drive down the cost.
Yep.
And then more people have access to it, which, by the way, is more people have access. Every business wants to continue to expand its markets. As more people have access, the cost will go down further.
Yep.
But they have an incentive to create the very awareness you just described, is my point.
It's with psilocybin anyway. So I know people who do this in smaller groups where they do ayahuasca together regularly. So they have a group kind of ethos around that and understanding. But with psilocybin, I think there are 3 really significant constitutional churches in America where the use of psilocybin as a sacrament is uncontestable legally.
Yeah, and it's interesting about this is that there's a whole lot that are operating that do not yet have legal a legal
And
canopy.
yes, and so, but here's the deal with that. In um, the group that is regularly using sacrament together and regularly talking about the effects and the responses and how their journey was, what was it like the last time, whatever, what came up, what did you process, how did that feel for you? Like those sorts of interactions are readily accessible these days to anyone who's curious about psilocybin. I can't speak for the others, but that one I know. And it's been very beneficial to have that. You're not alone. You don't have to grow your own mushrooms and take them on your own anymore. You can actually have group support for the process. Answer the questions. Even if you want, get training. You can become a trip sitter if you want to take that kind of training.
So it's interesting because people will develop in a cause missionary zeal.
Mm-hmm.
Missionary zeal involves being virtually volunteering or entirely volunteering. Missionaries have even been known to pay to be volunteers, right? They'll do something at considerable sacrifice to make some message or some idea or some value available. There are people that work with tremendous zealousness, for example, in homelessness, right? It's like they bring their own sandwiches, right, to go out.
Yep.
They don't go out looking for somebody else. They recognize there's a hunger problem and they just go out and do something about it, right?
Yep.
So you would have those kinds of people. And then I would like to point out that like you're right. Like I understand the safety canopy that begins to be created even in these small, because I believe in house churches, man. I believe in house churches. So if you're talking about like turning this into kind of some kind of spiritual thing, people should be able to do this at home.
Absolutely.
But, okay. And I'm not arguing against having the shaman present here. I'm endorsing what you're saying. It's kind of like you got a bunch of little missionary amateur shamans. And I would like to point out that grown men take powerful weapons, put on orange vests, and sit out in fields taking shots at random targets, right? I mean, they're obviously they're looking for something, and occasionally they do it badly and they end up hurting themselves or they hurt someone else. It does happen, right? And I don't want to ban that practice, right?
Right.
What happens most of the time is that fathers and grandfathers and uncles take out their sons and grandsons and nephews and even their daughters and nieces, right? They granddaughters, they take them out to learn how to do it. You have kind of the shamans, right? You've got the older wise ones that then take out the younger ones with them. Yep. And I don't see why that example doesn't connect here. This is a bunch of people who would, in essence, be looking out for each other. They would be people who've already walked a path before. They would be people of knowledge and considerable experience who could be guides or assistants to others in the same way that you might teach somebody else to go hunting, because safety is clearly an issue in both places.
The analogy is so apt. And thanks to Prohibition, we have not had that generational awareness in whole plant medicines for a while. So it's all underground. And this era we live in is where the underground is rising to the surface, and the experts in the underground are starting to have some influence in the conversation. And that's all good, but it's still, because it's illegal, it's still very difficult to get these conversations started. And they're much better than the conversations about whether or not we should legalize MDMA, They're actual conversations about the effects of what's going on in this process. And that's a sort of collective knowledge that we need, and there was none of that. There was no cushion of that for Joe to fall into,
Yeah.
So have that.
So metaphorically speaking, let us land the plane.
Yes.
I am whatever you want to think of Joe and his particular story, and your position to me is fairly clear. The common sense with what you just spoke, that, okay, are we better off if pilots are being treated than if they're covering up, right? You know,
Right. Right.
that need, that inability to actually be who you are, that you sense, you know, and in this case, you literally have concrete, very well spelled out reasons to know that there's no room for grace here. Like I got a mess inside me. Because the truth of the matter is, we've all got some kind of mess going on, right?
Yeah. Of course.
Everybody's got the thing that their cross that they're carrying, so
Yep.
or the thorn in their flesh. Everybody's got that. But we want a situation, regardless of occupation, where real people can get real healing. And it just so turns out that when we give that, we extend that grace to them, the rest of us are safer and better off for it.